In a recent episode of Star Trek Starfleet Academy, it was revealed that the Klingons were on the verge of extinction by the 32nd century, their numbers severely diminished by the destruction of their homeworld and other burn-related catastrophes. It's a sharp decline from a species that once ruled one of the largest empires in known space, a people with a warrior tradition that shaped them into some of the galaxy's fiercest fighters. But it was this warrior tradition that ultimately doomed the Klingons to this fate, condemning them to extinction one way or another. In this video, we'll explore why. I'm Captain Jack, and welcome to Trek Central. If you're enjoying these videos, consider supporting Trek Central on Patreon. With increasing copyright claims, it's getting harder and harder to create these Star Trek videos. As such, we need your help. Check out the Patreon link below. Alright, let's go. Before the rise of the United Federation of Planets, the Klingon Empire was one of the greatest powers in this region of space, having conquered countless worlds through the strength of its warriors. During the Federation's early years, the Klingon Empire was initially its main rival, but at the end of the 23rd century, relations began to warm between the two powers, and within another century, the Klingons and the Federation were allies, an alliance that was greatly strengthened on the battlefields of the Dominion War. By the end of the 24th century, the Klingon Empire was strong, fairly prosperous, and in a good diplomatic position despite its losses in the Dominion War. But by the late 32nd century, Klingon history had taken a turn for the worse. The burn, which rendered all dilithium inert, causing everything from warp cores to reactors to suffer catastrophic meltdowns. This hit the Klingon Empire especially hard, as the energy infrastructure of Kronos and many other Klingon worlds were built around dilithium reactors. When these exploded, they rendered Kronos and virtually every other Klingon world uninhabitable, killing billions of Klingons in the process. In Star Trek Starfleet Academy, we see that by 3195, only 8 of the Klingon Great Houses remain. The Klingon species is on the verge of extinction, and all that remains of the Klingon Empire are scattered convoys of refugees. For the most part, this is due to the freak catastrophe of the burn. The Starfleet Academy also shows that the Klingons aren't doing themselves any favours. They refuse any and all outside assistance, and they might have ended up doomed as a species if the Federation hadn't allowed them to conquer, and we use air quotes there, a new homeworld for them. As Starfleet Academy makes clear, it's the Klingons' right to be this way and maintain their culture as they see fit. But it's still clear that the Klingon way of life has problems, and they're more deep-rooted than just how the Klingons have chosen to respond to the burn. In fact, the problems with the way the Klingons do things were apparent long before the burn and the likes of Starfleet Academy, and it's bound to bring them to this point sooner or later. But before we get to that, let's take a step back for a second and discuss Klingon culture. The Klingons were a warrior society. Their way of life was based around honour, which dictated a Klingon's social and political standing, and honour in Klingon society was typically gained through combat. Klingons were expected to be aggressive and bloodthirsty, and combat was central to their lives. Many forms of disagreement were settled through honour duels in Klingon society, and war and conquest were crucial to the Klingon way of life. The conquest of Kronos by Kahless, after all, was the Klingon Empire's founding legend. As such, all Klingons were, typically, raised to be warriors, and to see themselves as warriors first and foremost. As recently illustrated in Starfleet Academy, the Klingon understanding of warrior was broad enough to allow Klingon society to be functional. Many different kinds of challenges, from actual combat to debate to marriage, were seen as battles in the Klingon worldview, and those who fought them were equally as worthy of the title of warrior. What mattered to the Klingons was the challenge and competitive nature of the act, and that a Klingon approached this challenge bravely with discipline and initiative, and without underhandedness or cowardly behaviour. Dishonourable conduct, cowardice especially, was considered worse than death. Far worse, given that the Klingons didn't fear death and embraced honourable death in battle, whereas cowardice was considered one of the worst possible moral failings. Still, the Klingon worldview was defined by war, and this left Klingon society with several blind spots. Academic pursuits that didn't present the sort of challenge Klingons craved were somewhat neglected, with Klingon medical science being a notorious example. Klingons who chose to become healers were sometimes disowned by their families for it, as in the case of a Klingon doctor, Antak, as seen in Star Trek Enterprise. The Klingon government also considered medical science a low priority field. Klingon medical science was in such a bad state that even great Klingon generals preferred to be treated by human doctors if they needed medical attention.
Klingons make great warriors, but terrible doctors. Captain. Just the man I wanted to see.
The lack of emphasis on medical science stems from the Klingon warriors' tradition. Klingons who were wounded in battle were expected to either power through it, succumb to their injuries, or commit a form of ritual suicide that was expected by any Klingon who, for one reason or another, could not perform the duties of a warrior any longer. Therefore, doctors weren't seen as all that necessary. But medicine wasn't the only field of science that Klingons neglected, as shown by the case of Kurak, a warp field specialist seen in the Next Generation, whose brilliant work was largely ignored by Klingon society. Science, with the likely exception of science of military applications, was often looked down upon by the Klingons as un-warrior-like, and the reason why stems from the Klingons' culture's fundamental ideals. At its root, Klingon culture was about competition, about proving oneself stronger or otherwise better than another by defeating in a contest. The focus of the Klingon Empire was on competition through conflict, proving the greatness of a Klingon warrior by conquering planets and slaying worthy foes. But other pursuits were valued as worthy of a warrior when they provided a similar opportunity to best an opponent and assert one's strength, while other pursuits were seen as less deserving. This drive to compete and to triumph over great opponents drove the Klingons to make many great accomplishments, but it was also their undoing. Competition does have advantages, but as shown by much of the Federation's history, collaboration usually yields more, and the Klingons' tradition's extreme emphasis on competition often kept them from working effectively with others. As seen throughout Enterprise and the Next Generation, when the Klingons lacked a major enemy or great challenge, the Great Houses became prone to infighting, and Starfleet Academy also shows that they are unwilling to accept even aid from their own allies, if they perceived it as charity rather than something they earned by triumphing in an honourable contest. More often than not, the Klingons' obsession with competition ends up being self-sabotaging. Across many Star Trek series, the Klingon Empire is often portrayed as in decline, and the blame is often laid at the feet of corruption at the highest levels of Klingon society. Ezri Dax provides a good example of this perspective in Deep Space Nine.
I think that this situation with Gowron is a symptom of a bigger problem. The Klingon Empire is dying, and I think it deserves to die.
You were right.
But it's more deep-rooted in that, because a lot of the time, the corruption at the top of a Klingon society comes down to the hyper-focus on competition, the need to triumph over one's rivals. In this particular example, Chancellor Gowron felt threatened by the success of General Martok, and deliberately sabotaged Klingon military efforts to undercut him, not just out of jealousy, but because he saw Martok as his enemy, and as Klingons do, he was fighting to win. A warrior culture creates enemies everywhere you look, even among your allies. The Klingon concept of honour is supposed to keep this tendency in check by restricting the ways competition can play out and instilling a greater loyalty to higher causes, but we see in numerous Star Trek series that it often just makes the problem worse. In the Next Generation episode, Sins of a Father, the discovery that the father of a powerful Klingon politician, Duras, has betrayed a group of Klingon colonists to the Romulans threatens to cause a civil war. As the blow this revelation would bring to Duras' honour was enough that he would tear the Empire apart over it. Chancellor Kempex attempts to cover this up ultimately leads to his assassination and civil war anyway, in the episodes Reunion and Redemption, all over the actions of a dead man, and how this affects the honour of Duras and his family. When the Klingon Empire is at peace for a sustained period, the principle of competition drives Klingons to squabble over power and prestige, leading to corruption and sometimes open infighting. But even when the Klingons have an enemy, their drive for competition still gets them in trouble. Their 23rd century Cold War with the Federation is a key example. The Klingons' drive to get an edge over their rivals push them to overmine Praxis, Kronos' moon, making it unstable in the process. In 2293, this led to the destruction of the whole moon, severely weakening the Klingon Empire and causing ecological devastation to Kronos, their homeworld. Klingon society was built for conflict, but endless conflict is not sustainable. It takes collaboration, as was competition, to build a functioning society, and while the Klingons broadened and refined their understanding of competition enough that the Klingon Empire could get by for centuries, it was still doomed to start dying as soon as the momentum of its initial expansions faded. The Klingon warrior philosophy ultimately wasn't very well suited to building a stable, lasting society, and the Klingons' refusal to budge from it condemned them to extinction. As a result, in Starfleet Academy, we see a Klingon society that still focuses on competition to the exclusion of all else, but that no longer has the strength to effectively compete. If the Federation hadn't deliberately set up an easy battle so they could conquer a new planet to call their own, they might have died out within a few generations. But even if the Klingons hadn't been so utterly devastated, their warrior philosophy would have eventually led them to the same place. They would either fight until they overextend themselves and bit off more than they could chew, or the Empire would tear itself apart. Even with the Klingons claiming a new homeworld, infighting could still very easily prove the end of them. The Klingons did sometimes at least partially acknowledge the flaws of their society and course corrected, as in the decision to make peace with the Federation after the destruction of Praxis. But so far, they haven't been willing to confront the core problems of their philosophy and way of life, and as the species remains perilously close to the brink of extinction, their culture's deep flaws could still give them the final shove over the edge. Of course, as Starfleet Academy also pointed out, it's well within the Klingons' rights to choose this fate. Empires, species, and cultures, like people, all die eventually, and no self-respecting Klingon warrior fears an honourable death, even if it's premature. It would after all be very Klingon for the Klingons to go extinct on their own terms, and they would probably prefer that to the alternative. But for the Star Trek universe as a whole, it would still be a great loss. Okay, that's our analysis of the Klingon Empire. We'd love to hear yours. Be sure to let us know if you agree or disagree in the comments below. If you want to keep up to date on the latest Star Trek news, lore, and more, then make sure to hit that subscribe button to never miss a video from the team here at Trek Central. You can also follow us on social media or join our community Discord server. A big thank you to everyone who supports us on Patreon. Your support allows us to continue making these Galaxy class videos. For now, I've been Captain Jack, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Live long and prosper, my friends. Goodbye.